Good. Well, welcome. This is our, we're actually on the fourth session here, so we have one more next week of this, and the one next week will be, we're going to look at anticipating resurrected life, so it'll be more of a biblical, theological look at the resurrection and how we understand the resurrection. So that will be our conclusion. But today, then, we are going to focus on burial, and theme deciding where and how to be buried. It's what I have noticed is how I've been pastor now for 36 years, over 36 years, and it's been interesting to see the changes that have happened along the way. Now, I started out in Decatur, Illinois. Interesting enough, you might think in the Midwest that most funerals would be in churches. But in Decatur, virtually all the funerals were not at the church. They were at the funeral home at that time. Yeah, and it was kind of surprising. And then I came to McMinnville here in Oregon, and there was one main funeral home in town. They've been the funeral home for decades, and virtually everything went through them, but they were very supportive. They were devout Episcopalians, and they were very supportive of having services in the churches, would even encourage people to have services in the church. And this is Oregon, where a lot of people aren't necessarily connected with the church. But I still remember I was riding out with him to the committal, because it was more traditional where he had the service, and then we went out to the cemetery. And he told me that he had to preside for a funeral service, but he said virtually everybody still wanted to have a pastor, even if they weren't connected with the church. That isn't the way it is necessarily now. So it's things have been evolving along the way, and we hardly ever have a casket here at the church. It's very seldom we have a casket now, and so we don't even have a funeral home here. They'll take care of arrangements with the family that related to burial or cremation and all of that. But the memorial services, we do the planning for virtually all of them and just do it right here in the house. So now there's other options. That's what we're going to talk about today, just kind of the variety of options for burial. And I came across I have it in the footnote here, but this Christian Century is sort of a mainline periodical, I guess you'd call it, for mainline churches and anybody else that's interested. But they had a whole issue here last year in July on green burial, an act of faith, they called it. So that was interesting, and one of the resources I had.
I didn't hear the second part of the name. Christian what?
Christian Century, it's called.
Century.
Yeah, and you could, most articles, I get it, I'm a subscriber, but if you plugged in the article, it would still come up for you. And then, if you wanted to get it every week kind of thing, you'd have to, but I think you could see the articles still from that. If you plug in the title of the article. All right, well, the scripture verse started with there is Joseph of Arimathea went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus, and then he took it down, wrapped it in a linen cloth, and laid it in a rock-hewn tomb where no one had ever been laid. So it's very interesting. So it's a rock laden, so we think of kind of like a cave is what we imagine it being. And so Joseph of Arimathea was one of the leading religious leaders of that time, Jewish, and he was moved to provide a place to bury Jesus. So it's one of the key parts of the story of the Passion of Jesus. And then I was struck where no one had ever been laid. Imagine we would not have enough caves to put everybody in today. I mean, that just wouldn't be practical, but that's where Jesus was buried. All right, so just a few minutes here. I'll get started priming the pump. Where and how have your closest deceased loved ones been buried? And it may be that you've seen some differences over the years, too, with various people that you know well or fairly well have been buried. But go ahead and just talk with groups of 3, 4. Oh, it's good to hear all the talk going on, but it's hard to interrupt that. But we'll continue. So the first section there I have is on burial options. So there's a variety of those. So the first one is burial at a conventional cemetery, which is for much of my first few years of being a pastor, both in Decatur, and then also in a little town called Franklin Grove, had a main cemetery there where most people tended to be buried, and then even McMinnville, even though we worked with a funeral home, it seemed like there was people were starting to do things, have some variations in how we went about it, even though the funeral home was still handling most things. And then since I've been up at Trinity in Tacoma, Trinity had its own cemetery, which was interesting, and the plots were pretty reasonable, and so a number of people had plots that they had purchased there, and so that was gotten used. But it was still the style of worship services and memorials, funerals, and all that was really changing. And one of them I did for this professor of mine. He was buried at the cemetery, but he had been cremated. So it was one example of where some of this was changing. And then since I've been at St. Andrew, again, it's got to be 85-90% are memorial services. And then people here, because you're in a metro area like this, there's all sorts of different ways that people have dealt with in terms of where the burial happens, or the final resting place, as we say. Another possibility is a green burial, what's called a green burial, but doing it in an established conventional cemetery. So some of these cemeteries are adjusting to what's happening here. And I listed one that I came across. So if you I've got the link, but if you just Googled Riverview Cemetery here in the Portland area, it's prominent. You can look up their green burial thing, and they'll tell you what's involved and so on with that. So that's then home burial is an option. Here in Oregon, that's considered an option. Cremation and then be in a conventional cemetery, so that's another way. And then what's called open air cremation, and I don't know a lot about that, but that's one of the things people have done is, actually, I guess I don't know if this is exactly what they meant by that when I read about that one, but when Roy Luttrell died, who was the custodian here, he had some family, but they really weren't going to be part of things, and so we wanted to have a service, so we had a memorial service here. We actually had it out in the Sanctuary of the Firs, and various people ended up helping dispose his ashes in the Sanctuary of the Firs, and that's how we did that, and that was that's how we handled that. And then I don't have that one listed here, but like a mausoleum where you go and you could put the body there too, but often now would be the ashes, and it's put in a little vault as a mausoleum. So those are some of the more common options. These others I listed there just is what people do with bodies. Freezing of bodies, cryogenics. And Ted Williams, if you're a baseball fan and you know baseball history, Ted Williams, it's not surprising just from the stories I've heard about him that he probably wanted his body frozen. But that's what was done with his body, and I think his son's body also got frozen. And the idea, I suppose, is maybe there'll come a time when you might be able to unfreeze people or something like that. But
I was going to say that columbariums in churches are a really common thing now.
Yeah.
And to be able to have a place outside where, especially if you can build a labyrinth that can be walked in that area, and then members or people who want to be buried, their ashes can be placed in the columbarium. And I really like that idea.
Yeah, I was taking this list from this book on Preparing to Die, which actually is written by somebody of Buddhist faith, and so it was a nice chapter looking at different options. But interesting enough, when we were going through the facility project and the planning for it here, John Core, Christine Core's husband, he talked pretty seriously about wanting to do something like that as part of the project. And I think he even had in mind, you look at our back patio out here, that maybe a wall could be done there. Of course, knowing this congregation, the wall could only go up as high as the lowest part of the windows because nobody would want their view blocked. That was one of the bigger issues about blocking the view. But that was one thing that was thought of, but we didn't follow through on that. Is what, yeah.
It's a big project, but
Yeah.
it's a really meaningful thing
Oh, yeah.
for a parish to do.
Yeah, no thanks. Any others that you're aware of?
Well, I just recently read about a company, wherever it is, I don't know, because I don't know if I read this in the paper or if it was an ad in the paper or I heard it on TV. But there's a company that takes your body and, I guess it would have to be cremated, and they mix it with all kinds of straw and stuff and dirt, and then that's put in your garden.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
So that's like
You
a,
guys heard about that?
Yes.
do you know what the term was for that?
Decomposition, they actually
yeah.
take the body and let it decompose.
Yeah,
There you go.
yeah, all right.
With stuff like that.
So it's kind of a variation on, it's like variation on green burial and cremation, I guess is what it is, yeah.
In China, when we were there, we could see where the Chinese people, once they would die, would put the body up in the side of a hill or something.
Okay.
And they would mark it, and that's where the birds can come.
Oh, interesting, interesting,
And then the rivers,
yeah.
or in the caves further.
Fran?
I remember you had an ad in the paper a while back saying, I think it's on Easter Day or around Easter, you could for free scatter ashes near the water.
Okay,
Community invitation.
yeah.
Did it say
And
water?
I'm trying to think of,
It's a river.
Oh, I don't know.
no, go ahead, Diana.
My husband and my mother-in-law were both buried on Puget Sound. And in Washington, there are laws about how far out away from things you have to be. But they both did a tour, and everybody went together and did that. And I remember now, too, that my dad was buried, his ashes were scattered in a compostable, what do you call it?
Urn?
Yeah.
Well, urn,
It wasn't an urn, it was just a little box.
Okay.
Beautiful rice paper.
interesting.
And it would just decompose in the river as it went, but that was on the Williamsons.
I may need
And
to,
that was, he loved to fish.
my oldest, this just reminds me, my oldest son, Isaac, and you have to understand this is a dad and son's humor. And so we fish on the Deschutes, and I said, you know, Isaac, just throw me in the Deschutes when the time comes. And I'd actually be serious, except he'd probably get in trouble, you know, if something like that when the time comes. But then he was joking, well, because my favorite fishing place is an eddy, and he said, what if you get in that eddy, you'll just keep going around. But yeah, that's what you reminded me when you talked about loving to fish and that. And notice what I notice is the people are thinking this through in the variety of ways. And I also think the way we bury today basically was not the way we buried. You know, when you're on the Oregon Trail, you don't end up going to a funeral home if somebody dies, and so you bury people in the ground, you know. And so, but that came in, you know, maybe a little less than 100 years ago is when you started getting more working with funeral homes. And again, I'm not putting that down. I mean, that's funeral homes. The funeral director, especially the one in McMinnville that I dealt with all the time, they were very thoughtful people and about really tried to work with families and that. But people are looking at a variety of ways, and part of it's just plain cost too. Because it's not cheap to go through the full thing when you get the casket and all of that. There's a lot of expense there. Let's see, I had two other, Claudia and then Jan.
I know in Forest Grove, we have a park that's not very far from us.
Yeah.
And there are several people that have been ashes have been planted in trees on top of them.
Oh.
And then they have a marker
Yeah.
of that tree.
Where my oldest daughter, who's a pastor in Eugene, is talking about what if we had a piece of property where family members could be buried in the ground, and then you'd plant the tree like you're talking about, and that would be, the one thing that can be lost sometimes with some of the ways we do things is, for some people, it's very helpful to have a sense of place. And that's where, so a tree, though, can do that, too. I mean, but some place where you can go and remember the person. And that seems to be really important for people.
No, I know the person that I know was buried there. Every time I walk around that area, I think of her.
Yeah, so that's just what we're talking about. Yeah, so that it can help to really just process that, because we don't get everything processed. When somebody dies, we don't process it all right away, and so having time to really reflect on it, and then it's part of the grieving process can take a long time. And there's no exact formula, and it can come back. Yeah, it can. You never really completely get over it. I haven't forgotten my mom just because it was a long time ago. I don't forget her. I'm not as preoccupied as I was initially with it. But Jan, you had something?
Yes, you can be added to fireworks in Hillsborough.
You can be added to fireworks. Oh dear, I'm not quite sure what you would call that, what the name of that is, but that's going out with a bang or something. Leave it to Oregon to come up with all these creative ways of doing it. Has everybody ever heard of Cremation? This was new to me, disposing of the body by way of freeze drying. So not just freezing, cryogenics is freezing of bodies, but it's freeze drying. So apparently that's one way of doing it. And then one of the other options, of course, is donation to science, which maybe usually isn't not always the whole body, but parts of the body. But I guess, and that just kind of depends on where you're at. Sometimes if a very young person dies, you can use virtually everything, I think. But that's another option.
You can use donation. You can do donation and still be cremated.
Or whatever else, yeah.
Right.
So if you have something to donate that's a good thing then.
Is that not our driver's license?
Yeah, I think that's where mine is.
So I don't know if that's where they look for or not.
I have mine also in my, of a power of attorney type of thing.
Oh yeah, so you put it in your will.
If mine's in that as well, it says, organ donation, whatever is not donated will be cremated.
Yeah.
That in my list of.
So it can be like in your the will and everything you have for that, and then also it can be on. I think we're asked that question when we get a driver's license. It's been a while since I actually.
You are, but current regulation is if you are an organ, a solid organ donor, like kidney or lung or something like that, that even if you haven't designated it, they can do it.
Oh, is that right? Okay, interesting. So it can be, you may get donated, if you have something that can save somebody else's life, that's the thinking about it, they can use it. Yeah. Well, you know from personal, when you're family with Scott. All right, then the next thing, burial and cremation laws in Oregon. I thought that was, and I finally just ended up printing this up, but it was found it online, and various questions. We're not going to go through all these now, but I did look, given the theme for today, on page 3, it says, where can bodies be buried in Oregon? And so you have some very specific instructions, and I like this document because it's relatively concise, too, so gives us a chance to look at the actual laws here in Oregon, which means also that like if you have a family member in another state, you probably need to, there may be some variations from state to state in terms of how these things are dealt with, and it's important just to be, aware of that. This Barbara Carnes, who we'll be having a conversation with on Tuesday. If you saw that end of the new rules for end of life, one of the things is, well, there's basically 2 ways you can die. One is, quickly, and the other one is over time. And generally, if it's over time, you do have some time then to get ready for it. But what's tricky is when it happens just like that, and and then you've got to try to figure things out in a hurry, and that can complicate matters, yeah.
Advanced directives.
Advanced directives, yeah, to give instruction for,
That should be mentioned.
yeah, no, that's help, it can be very helpful, and then also who's going to be the person making medical decisions for you is important. You know, if you're married or have a partner, or how that person's a logical person, it can be, I think I mentioned in our case, if something happens to Donna and me, then our daughter Rachel's the one that makes the medical decisions, and our daughter Mattia is the one that's in charge of the financial side of things. And so, again, just being aware of these things is important. Well, and then the next question too, where can we store or scatter ashes after cremation in Oregon? So again, just some, it's just good to be aware of what you can and can't do here in the state of Oregon. And it's there's a lot of options, I guess, is what I would say on that. But
Do you see anything on composting?
well, that's what you were just mentioning. What the one variation of is your ashes are mixed in with, yeah, and
No cremation, it's just,
just compost. Well, that would be. I think that's a form of green burial, is what I would call that. Yeah, composting. So I've heard of people doing that. I think I've heard more often though of your body being buried in that way. But I suppose it could be done with composting too. I'm not necessarily up on it. Yeah, yeah.
what do you say, Joanne?
That's what the article I saw was talking about. And they showed a picture of straw and.
Putting it all together. Yeah, yeah.
It's the body, not just the ashes.
Well, I don't know how they prepared the body to make it into compost, but it was mixed with other compost material and put in the garden.
Yeah. So that might have been ashes, and that
Like
could.
that, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. You're pushing the limits of my knowledge here. But I think the point is notice people are thinking up new ways of doing it. So it's not just one way of handling this. We do have options. Just a bit about green burial then, and I'll give you some of the highlights of this article, but green or natural burial as an act of faith. So up until the 1930s, natural burial was the norm. That's what you did, and so if you were out on a farm, we've watched, what's the series? My mind's going blank, but it's up in Alberta, and it's been going on for all sorts of seasons. Oh, how can I forget the title? I watched every episode with Donna. But it's the ranch family, and they have a place there on their ranch where a little area where all the people have been buried through the time. And so that was very common, in many places to have an area where people were buried when they died.
LBJ Ranch is like that.
Oh, is that LBJ Ranch in Texas?
Say something.
Tim? Yeah.
Oh, I was going to say, a lot of these services are not that easy to find. And I was looking for Cremation. There's very few services that provide that. And I think if you look for green burial, whoever's in charge of managing that might have trouble finding it.
Okay, all right. So we'll see, it may become more common and then it'd be more available. So, but, yeah.
At this time, some of those things are hard to find.
Well, and that's where I would emphasize again then, if you're dealing with this and with a sudden death, the time it takes could take longer. And so if you're really interested in something, time to do the homework would be, now rather than later, so to speak. And so you're ready when the time comes, and make sure that you have conversation with everybody that needs to be have a conversation with about these things. Diana?
One of the things that really surprised me, and I had my husband cremated 3 years ago now, but instead of going through all of the channels that you usually go through, and which I had planned to go through, I found by talking to friends and family that Amazon, of all places, sold all kinds of burial urns.
Oh,
And I ended up getting 2 different kinds. One was compostable, and the other one were little tiny keepsake things so that I can have his ashes scattered wherever I end up.
yeah.
Having mine scattered too.
All right, so I need to put this is, you can actually get a variety of urns on Amazon. Not surprising that Amazon would, make it available. Yeah.
Have you ever heard of alkaline hydrolysis before?
Yeah, I like that one. I've been reading that one.
That's one that's
That would
really
be
hard to
closer
find.
to,
Oh, is that the one that's hard to find?
compostable
I would
thing.
think so.
The large funeral homes would have that service, but smaller ones probably do not.
Yeah.
All right. So again, just to point out, if you get, boy, that might be something I'm interested in. Doing the homework on it is going to be really important, and do it when the pressure's not on. It's that's a, because then you're making, you want to be thoughtful about this, and so it's important not to be under pressure when you're trying to be thoughtful. Second point, fear of death has strongly shaped our burial practices ever since. And so this is, I think I mentioned, maybe it was last week or sometime, but one of the losses with not having, seeing the body, even what we thought, we were talking about viewing, I think. Was that last week or the week before? We were talking about viewing and trying to make the person look just like they looked when they were alive. That's one thing, but seeing the body, dealing with the death, that can be very, very, I think, helpful in dealing with the reality of the death. And the truth was, we're going back with hospice. We've gotten going back to where people are dying. Many people, if possible, are dying in their homes. It doesn't always work out, so there's nothing, it's not like it's bad to not die in your home, but if it's possible and you can get the care you need and die in your home, it can be very helpful to the family and maybe to the person who's going through the dying process too. So John Fritz just died this week.
Oh, he did?
Yeah, and
I was going to call him.
yeah, well, and he went, it turned fairly quickly, because, so I was there on Monday, and he died on Tuesday. But the caregiver that I talked with on Monday, who's a hospice caregiver, and they had 4 of them, each doing 24-hour shifts is what they were doing. She was relatively new, but 3 days before that, she had had a conversation. He was asking her questions about, where she's from and all of that, just being John Fritz, how he is, and which is, interesting enough, not necessarily that common that close to his time of death, he would be having that kind of conversation, given some of the stuff that this Barbara Carnes has even shared with us and some of the materials, and my own experience just with people, they reach a point where they're not going to have that kind of conversation. But he was able to die there in his own home. Now there's, again, all these things, costs are involved with this and that, but I think dealing with the reality of death and being around it, and back on the farm 100 years ago in Wisconsin, people died in the home. They didn't die somewhere else, and so maybe death was more a part of things. And then we've struggled with some fear of death and kind of put it out there, and we don't have to dwell in it, I don't think. So that would be one extreme, but also just taking it, recognizing it is part of life, and that's why Barbara Carnes calls it the final act of living. Julie.
One of the most beautiful things I ever heard was a colleague in Minnesota who, with her siblings, marked her brother's death. And he was a bachelor who had moved to the family farm and was alcoholic and really struggled all of his life. And when Luke died, his siblings came to the farmhouse and prepared his body, washed him, and put clean clothes on him. And they were they were fine Catholic people, and I think that was more their tradition. But when Sharon, his sister, described Luke's death and the powerful act of caring for his body in their home, in the farmhouse, and then celebrating his life, I have never forgotten that story.
Yeah, so that was more, again, that kind of pattern was more common in some years ago. But it's come back some with hospice and others, not just hospice, but others. There's just been more attentiveness to how we care for people, not just at the end toward death, but just along the way as people move toward that point. There's more attention to that. Trent?
When our daughter passed away, in her house,
Yeah.
the hospice nurse there, her pastor was there, her 3 young children, the youngest was 3 years old to about 7, and a lady from the church who dealt with the kids and had a lot of experience in dealing with the death of parents or family members with kids. So she was there. Don and I were there, and I thought that was very special.
Yeah, to
Because
just...
we all knew that it was just about the end, and Dawn was holding your hand on her last breath.
Oh, man, yeah. No, that's special.
Very special.
All right, greener natural burial, just a definition, caring for the dead with minimal environmental impact. So there can be that angle on this. Foregoing chemical embalming, opting for a shroud or biodegradable coffin rather than popular steel or fiberglass if a coffin's required. Skipping the cement vault and using cemetery that practices land conservation. Well, what you were talking about, this family in Minnesota, was it? So look at more participatory burial process, washing and dressing your loved one's body at home, accompany them to the grave site, physically laying them into the ground, fully covering their body with dirt. So really, the loved ones are the ones that, and it's not always possible again. So these are not meant to judge the ways we've dealt with it in the past necessarily, but offering us another way of looking at it. And then the importance of exposing our children and ourselves to the reality of death, the final act of life. We had a 47-year-old husband and father, when I was at Trinity in Tacoma, family well established in the community and at the church. This was Trinity in Tacoma, where you can hold 500 people. We had 700 and some for this one. What I remember most, though, is not even that service. What I remember is how he invited his 3 children. He had 2 teenage boys and then a 2-3-year-old girl who would always get him the newspaper. So that was the thing. But what he did is, what he was still aware is, he called each one of them into his, he was actually in a hospital room at that point, and he wanted to give a final blessing to them. And I haven't talked to I don't know, with the little girl now, would be grown up, and it would be, and she probably wasn't even going to remember him. But that was how he dealt with it. So they didn't hide. What I'm getting at is, they didn't hide what was happening to him. He shared it with his children and wanted to, and especially his teenage sons. I think he wanted to make sure, he left some word of encouragement with them. Then it's, a blessing to love our loved ones through death. So really, that's what we're talking about here, is how can we bless our loved ones through the dying process, or this final act of living.
I just have a ritual that was part of my family. So whenever my family in Minnesota, my extended family, would get together, my grandmother would have us all join hands in a circle for the prayer before our meal, and she would have us look around the circle and remember the people that were not with us anymore. And so it was kind of an ongoing reflection of honoring people who were gone, but also celebrating those who were still with us.
Huh.
That was very powerful, because I think sometimes the rituals that we have, particularly in our culture, there aren't many of them to acknowledge loss. which takes a long time.
Yeah.
So it was just a very powerful memory.
Yeah. Well, and you're sharing memories of the person in terms of the way they lived their life, but also taking the fact of their death seriously at that point. You're doing both, and that's. And I've said this before. So we had Phyllis Morris's service yesterday, but we remembered her life, mourned her death, and then looked for a word of hope from God. Those are the things we do in each service. And one of her family members mentioned that when we planned the service, it was really helpful to do the sharing memories. And I would say that's helpful in planning for a service, but just in general, I think remembering people and telling stories about people is just a good thing at any time along the way. And the fun, some of the funny stories too become part of, I think it almost prepares, we're not thinking of necessarily preparing for death, but those kind of memories and telling the stories about, like I said with my dad, my kids want to have his memorial service before he's dead. So he has to hear the stories they remember, and they're only half kidding, actually. We haven't done that, but they talk about it. Yeah, St. Andrew could tell just the 1 year he was here, there were some stories that came out of that time.
I remember a story about Martin Luther King Jr. where he was with his disciples or gathering, and they were, he was talking about the possibility of death because of what he was doing. And so he had all his friends tell stories of what they're going to tell about him.
Oh, so it's kind of like, don't tell my kids that, because if Martin Luther King Jr. did that, they'll want to do that for sure. All right, it's almost time for us. So I would just say this is green burial would be, trying to take our Earth Care core value seriously. Really, what does that mean for us? And then also, perfection in these things is just not a good goal. And so it's really more a matter of finding our way and being loving and caring in the process. That's what's crucial here. And then you finally, you have to do it at a certain point, and then you learn from it, and it's all part of the process of living and how we work, but learning too as we go through this. And but it's helpful that people are exploring some other ways of doing things, maybe, because that can help us along the way. And certainly hospice has been so important. And so Barbara Carnes, 7 o'clock on Tuesday, question and answer time, so it'll be via Zoom. The email is going out this afternoon and you may have seen it, but that'll have the link. That'll be the easiest thing, is just to look at that email. But that goes out this afternoon. And then most of you may have seen the new rules. If you were here the first session, you saw that DVD. But if you haven't seen it, that'll be on that same Zoom link at 6:30. And so that would be a great way to just get ready for the conversation. And then, we'll see how many people come. And so sometimes in the table talks, if you have 10 people, everybody gets to ask whatever question, but be ready, with a question or a comment. I think it's even helpful to her, I would think, in her work, if something really was helpful to you. It might not even be where you ask a question, but you say, this was really helpful in that DVD or in that book. That's something that really made an impression on me or something. So those could be helpful comments as part of a table talk like that. And then next week, like I said, we'll be doing that. Taiwan Church hopes to start worshiping next week, so we'll need to really move out of here. When we're done, we'll move out of here relatively quickly so they can get set up for worship at 11. All right, Jan.
I was at, of course, Phyllis's memorial, and afterward, Sue found out why Louie was played during Polo.
Oh.
You know?
They mentioned that they wanted it, but I didn't know the full story.
Phyllis was very involved with her daughter's marching band.
Oh, okay, I knew that.
The band played Louie when she was doing the things with the marching band.
Yeah, so that's the...
I wanted that.
Yeah. Yeah. So,
Louie's not your normal.
let's just say Susan Reiser, who's been a organist longer than I've been a pastor, but I've been a pastor a long time, We had never included Louie Louie in the prelude to it. That was a first. Leave it to Phyllis Morris to end up even to having a first. Go in peace. Serve the Lord.
Thank you.